I am Glenn Zane, and I'm a forester. I was born in Modesto, California, and spent my growing up years in California. I lived for part of that time in the desert area around Lancaster and even Boron, which you'll have to look up to see where it is. And most of my growing up years were spent in Sonoma County near Glen Ellen. My family's place that they homesteaded in the 1850s was near about a mile and a half from Glen Ellen, and I grew up there. My parents were divorced when I was about a year and a half old, and my paternal grandmother stepped in and raised me. She sent an ornery little boy to school and saw to it that I got my lessons appropriately through about the 5th grade, and then I started going back and forth between my two parents, and my mother and stepfather lived in the desert area around either Lancaster or in Boron for several years. And so I spent a couple of grammar school years there and one high school year there. My first year in high school was at what was then called Muroc Air Force Base, now Edwards Air Force Base, and I went to school in Quonset huts that were left over from the Second World War. Then I went back to Sonoma and spent the last 3 years of high school there. I graduated in 1957 from Sonoma High School, one of a class of about 100, and then went home expecting that I was going to start school the next year and probably studying engineering. I had a call over the weekend from a Kentucky cousin who was the dispatcher for the California Division of Forestry in Santa Rosa at the time. And in his Kentucky drawl, he said something like, "Glenn, would y'all like a job this summer?" And that was the way that I really got introduced to forestry, because I'd grown up on a farm. I knew how to fix things and run equipment and do various other things like milk cows. So I enjoyed the outdoors and always enjoyed hunting, and we had plenty of space to do things. But I honestly really never had considered a career in forestry until I went to work. I was noticing as I stepped back into the room that the picture behind me is in the screen, and I'll just give you a 30-second vignette. That picture was painted by an old maid school teacher named Alice Weaver that lived up the road from where I grew up in Sonoma County. And Alice Weaver would frequently show up at what we called dinner time on the farm, which was at noon, in her Model A Ford. And my grandfather, who I was living with, would announce to his wife, Minnie, my grandmother, that our star boarder has shown up. But in all of that, at some point in her life, Alice gave my grandmother the picture that's behind me, and I inherited it. It was then called the Division of Forestry. It's now Cal Fire, but I started as a firefighter, like most everybody did. I learned how to operate a McLeod and a Pulaski and a backpack pump, and put out fires by putting a line around them, and lay a hose line and all of the things that firefighters need to learn to do. That fall, so that would have been the fall of '57, I had an opportunity to become a firefighter truck driver, which was the next step above firefighter in those days, and I took it, and I worked in Santa Rosa on what was then called Schedule A. I'm not sure how it's termed today, but the counties specifically paid for work that fire control work that the state funded with state fire equipment. And so I stayed there and planning to go to school, which I by that time had decided I would study forestry. And I took the examination when it came for a civil service position of firefighter truck driver, passed that and was hired, and then still in Santa Rosa, working in Sonoma County. I worked at Healdsburg and Cloverdale at various times, and at Mendocino, which is a station out on the coast, and at Cazadero. And then I took the examination for firefighter foreman, which was the next step up, and I did that specifically with the idea that I would take a leave of absence and go to Humboldt to college at that from that position. I passed it and was hired in Humboldt County and went to work and was the foreman at the Bald Hills Fire Station, which is now part of the Redwood National Park. And I was foreman there for a couple of years and went to school in the wintertime. And then in one summer, I think it was '63, I believe it was '63, I went to work as the firefighter foreman in charge of the helitack crew. And somewhere around here I have a picture of a much younger version of me with a crew of 4 or 5 people that were tied to a Hiller 12E helicopter that we kept near Garberville, and we flew off of the Grasshopper Lookout Station that summer. And so I really enjoyed that work. It was fun. And I was very thankful for being able to work for the state because by working essentially full-time in the summer, I was able to be paid until usually 1st of November or something like that. And that's the way I got through school. I didn't have any sort of support system. So I worked while I was going to school and worked during the summer. And by the time I was in school, my wife and I had our first child, and our second child came along before I graduated. So I worked, and I jokingly told the people at Simpson Timber Company that I probably should have filed belatedly some sort of a workers' comp claim because I lost the hearing in my left ear pulling on the planer chain at in the bottoms out west of Arcata. During the time that I was at Humboldt, which by the way then was Humboldt State College, I met and worked with Kenneth Bowe, who was the director of the Pacific Northwest or Pacific Southwest Experiment Station office that was located at that time on campus. And I very much enjoyed the work that I did with him in research. And I had decided at that point that I would stay on and probably get a master's and maybe a doctorate. And during my last year of school, I did a study involving tan oak, which is a kind of a weed species still today, but I did a yield analysis for that, and I actually had a fellowship to stay at Humboldt and work on a master's degree. However, in 1965, with the political issues surrounding the initial Redwood Park, what we called the take at that point, other people called it different things, but with that issue, the professors that I really wanted to study under had decided that they were going to leave Humboldt. And so there was an exodus of several key professors that I wanted to study with, and I decided that I was going to get a job. And so in 1965, a couple of months before graduation, I was able to find a job in Mendocino County, and I went to work for Hollow Tree Lumber Company. Hollow Tree Lumber Company was a company that was harvesting a tract of about 50,000 acres of redwood property in the Gualala and Garcia River drainages. And my job when I arrived there, as described to me by the logging superintendent, Claude Stanley, was keep track of 12 GIPO loggers. And in those days, filing a timber harvest plan was a matter of figuring out where you were on the ground, filling out a 1.5-page form, and sending it in duplicate or triplicate to the CDF inspector, and that was what you had to do. There was no waiting for review at that point. A GIPO logger in those days was a terminology applied to contract loggers, and most of those loggers had a very small crew themselves and 2 or 3 other people, one loading machine or some mechanism for loading, trucks, a Caterpillar tractor to skid with and build skid trails. One of the important lessons that I learned as a young forester, and I have tried to tell several people this over the intervening years, is that one day I showed up on a landing, and I had been walking through the area that was logged by this particular logger, whose first name was Andy, and this poor guy was under his 977 track-laying cat loader with hot hydraulic fluid running down his arms trying to fix it. I showed up on the landing to announce to Andy that he hadn't put in some water bars on some skid trails. I was able to exit the landing without wearing the 14-inch crescent that he had in his hand around my neck, but it taught me a very valuable lesson. Try to figure out what people are doing before you point out a problem that they might have. My wife, who had grown up in Redding, really wanted to move back to Redding. And I found out through an acquaintance, Hal Bowman, that there was a forester's job open at Paul Bunyon Lumber Company in Anderson, California. I applied, interviewed, and was hired. The guy that hired me was probably one of the people that I would point to as being the one of the key individuals in my life to help me figure out how to do things. His name was Lem Hastings. He was actually on the Board of Forestry for a while in the early years, and he graduated with a degree in English from Princeton in 1936. The Walkers, one of whom owned Paul Bunyon Lumber Company, hired him to work on Red River Lumber Company problems at that point in Westwood, California. And from there he kind of worked with Kenneth Walker, the owner of Paul Bunyon, more than others, and ended up as the resource department manager for Paul Bunyon Lumber Company. Lem, by the time I met him, was well into dealing with Parkinson's. I was still in my 20s at that point and was trying to figure out how to do things, and especially how to be involved in business. Paul Bunyon was a company that owned a good bit of timberland at that point through one of the related entities, and so the opportunity there was to work with loggers who were delivering logs to the mill at that point. And I learned something about the Sierras in forestry, and as I said, I learned a good bit about dealing with life from Lem Hastings, and I really point to him as a mentor in my life. He introduced me to a lot of individuals, some of whom you probably will be interviewing. One of the guys, for instance, was Dick Roseberry, and he was the father of the Dick Roseberry that you may be interviewing, and he worked for what was then Diamond International Company, and got involved because of Lem and him. I got involved in dealing with taxation matters, and I spent a lot of time in my life dealing with taxation. During the last 2 years that I worked for Paul, or last actually 3 years that I worked for Paul Bunyon Lumber Company, I was involved in one of the most interesting projects that any young forester could ever be involved in. I was asked by Ken Walker, the owner of the company, to assist in partitioning what was then the Red River Lumber Company, 750,000 acres, because Ken was due to receive a portion of that. By the time I got involved, the attorneys group, including attorneys for Kimberly-Clark Corporation, the Walker family, and some other owners that were involved, had decided about how they were going to have to do it to partition the land in order to avoid having any of the participants paid income tax on the property. And the way that it had to happen is the partitioning had to be done in a manner that gave proportionate value to each of the owners in recognition of their percentage ownerships. Now, one of the interesting things is that some of the percentage ownerships were calculated on a 100-key Monroe calculator out to the 7th decimal place. And during the time that we were working on the partitioning, we had to design and complete an inventory, a detailed inventory for the entire 750,000 acres, and then figure out how to partition the property off so that everyone could, whether they thought were happy or not was immaterial, but they could accept it. Kimberly-Clark Corporation had acquired about a 1/3 interest in the entire entity of what was formerly Red River Lumber Company at that point. So they were represented on the partitioning committee, where I represented Ken Walker, by Hal Bowman, and the bulk of the rest of the Walker family was being represented by Mason Bruce Girard, by that time in the person of Gwyn Scherer. Gwyn was a forester and one of the owners in Mason Bruce and Girard at the time. The balance of the family, or the ownership, was represented, or was a company called Andrus Trust, and that company was represented by the other major forestry consulting firm in California at the time, Hammond, Jensen, and Wallen. So I was a young guy sitting in the presence of some august individuals at that point, and I think it's fair to say that I learned a tremendous amount about dealing with people and difficult problems in the years that we spent working on the partitioning. Towards the very end of the partitioning, after most of the lands had been partitioned, one day, kind of settling up one of the tails that came along with the hide, Gwyn Scherer and I spent a day together in the woods. And at the end of that day, he asked me if I would consider working with Mason Bruce and Girard, and I thought about that and told him I would think about it, did think about it, and went home, talked with my wife about it. My wife very definitely did not want to move from Redding. She enjoyed being close to family in Redding, and we were raising a family which by that time was 3 children. So I actually called Gwyn and told him that I wouldn't be joining Mason Bruce and Girard. However, I had decided by that time that I was going to separate from Paul Bunyon, not because I didn't enjoy working with Ken Walker, but because I decided that I really wanted to be in business independently. So I went about figuring out how to do that, and told Ken at Walker at one point that I was going to leave Paul Bunyon, and he asked me to stay for 3 months. And just as a passing note, I will tell you that if you're ever working for someone and they ask you to stay for 3 months, that it's a mistake. Because when you have decided that you're going to go to work for somebody else, you're going to be going to work for somebody else. And so even though I had tremendous respect for Ken, and I did enjoy the last several weeks that I worked there, there was very definitely a period of time when I was not 100% working for Paul Bunyon Lumber Company. At some point during that period of time, Gwyn Scherer called me and asked what I was doing. And as I told you, Wendy, earlier today, frequently Gwyn Scherer would call and say, "What the hell?" And he would start the conversation that way. And I always enjoyed dealing with Gwyn, partly because he was so direct. Maybe mostly because he was so direct. But I told him what I was about, and that I was planning on opening a consulting business in Redding. And he talked with me for a little while and said, what about you opening a Mason Bruce and Girard office in Reading. I'm not describing that exactly the way the conversation went, but that was the result of it. I talked with my wife, and she thought that would be acceptable and that we'd get to stay in Reading. And so we did that. And in 1974, on April Fool's Day, I started working for Mason Bruce and Girard in an office, a small one-room office that I rented in Reading. And I spent until 2003 working almost 100% of those years as an owner at Mason Bruce and Girard, and had a delightful career and time working with Mason Bruce and Girard. And I managed to, during that period of time, meet hundreds of interesting people, and I absolutely enjoyed working and doing what I did. Some of the people in the office would remember a cartoon that either I or somebody else pasted up by the door that shows a guy running into the office, swinging his briefcase and saying, "Hooray, it's Monday." And that was really the way I felt about working. One of them, particular to California, was the change from ad valorem taxation for timber to yield taxation. During that period of time, I was hired by the California Forest Protective Association to work with, kind of opposite from, the State Board of Equalization representatives that were developing the taxation system. And during that, involved in that work, I spent many days, hours, weeks working with most of the timber industry representatives from California, the people that represented the owners of timberland from California. Were designing a system that would work. We had in mind, and the State Board of Equalization had in mind, that we should shift from a ad valorem tax situation, which is a circumstance where you end up paying a value based on the value of your standing timber every year, to a yield tax arrangement where you would pay a yield tax, basically a tax representing the value of the timber that you harvested. Working with that system was a much better circumstance for timberland owners, because the burden of paying the ad valorem tax every year, whether or not you harvested timber, was removed. It was a very important change for California because we were able to allow payment of tax when the value was received. So, for instance, if a timberland owner sold $1 million worth of timber in 1 year, he would be obligated to pay tax based on that $1 million sale. He wouldn't be obligated to pay tax based on the remaining standing timber that he owned and held. And so it changed the structure of the tax very dramatically in a positive manner to allow management of timberland on a long-term basis in California. And I was happy to be part of that effort and believe that I did contribute something to it. I certainly did not design the system and certainly did not figure everything out as to how it might work. I will, however, cite one instance where I had worked something out, and one of the State Board of Equalization guys had worked out a similar case. His name was Kenneth Vroman. I visited him in his office and noticed that he had a map of the state of California, which I actually have a copy of behind me in my bookcase here. But I noticed that he had a copy of the map of the state of California broken up into what we call timber value areas. And his timber value area lines were almost identical to the timber value area lines that I and others in the timber industry had developed. At that point, I thought I probably could work with this guy. And the result of that was that in 1980, Ken Vroman joined Mason Bruce Girard, and we worked together for many years following that. Going back to the positive impact that resulted from the shift to yield tax from ad valorem tax, the ad valorem tax was basically a tax that was paid every year based on the value of the standing timber. However, there was a caveat that allowed timberland owners to remove from the tax rolls areas that had been harvested to the level of 70%. And so the goal of many timberland owners at that point was to reduce the harvest, the timberland that they owned, down to about 30% of the so-called original volume. There were lots of discussions about what original volume was and all of those things, as you would expect. But the impact of ad valorem taxation was to, from a ownership management point of view, force people to harvest timber that they would really prefer not to harvest from a standpoint of long-term growth and value. The shift to the yield tax basis allowed them, as timberland owners, to hold their timberland intact and hold their timber inventory intact and allow it to accrue growth and value, so that I believe that the state of California probably came out ahead dollar-wise based on the yield tax arrangement. So that just because timberland owners were able to hold their timber longer. During the period of time that I worked with Mason Bruce Girard, and I think it was about 1978, I received a phone call one fateful day from an attorney in San Francisco requesting that I represent Simpson Timber Company in valuing their timberlands that were being taken in what we called the second park take, so that there were three primary owners: Simpson, Arcata Redwood, and Louisiana Pacific Corporation, that were going to lose lands or give up lands in the second park take. The government was taking the lands under eminent domain, and they were obligated, the government was obligated to pay the timberland owners fair market value. getting to fair market value was the assignment that the foresters that were working for the various companies had. During that period of time, I was privileged to work with a person who is still my friend today, and became my friend. I had known him before, but definitely became my friend during that assignment. His name was Dean Solinsky. Frank and Dean Solinsky were very important consulting players in the Redwood region especially, and in other regions, but especially in the Redwood region of California. Dean Solinsky and I were asked to work together for Simpson Timber Company, and we spent several years developing timber volume tables and doing inventory work that resulted in Simpson Timber Company receiving what I believe today was fair market value for their timberlands. And well, during that period of time, we were able to work on several issues that I think have become more important to even the National Park Service today. For instance, the National Park Service today is fully aware that trees grow, and they are focusing on last year, 2016, they actually harvested some of the young stands inside of the boundary of the park in order to speed up the process of releasing the redwood trees that were commingled with the Douglas fir and other minor species in some of the park stands. And some of those areas were on areas that had been taken from Simpson Timber Company, and I was able to go back and look at them from the standpoint of what happens 30 or more years after a harvested area in the redwoods. During the work on the inventory that was necessary in order to determine the value for the lands that were going to be added to the Redwood National Park in the late 70s, we at Mason Bruce Girard and other company representatives had to do a very complete inventory of the trees. We actually completed a 100% count of all of the trees that were being taken from Simpson Redwood Company at that time. And I know some of the other companies likewise did a very complete inventory. Some of them were also 100% inventories, meaning that every tree was measured and counted. We spent a lot of time doing that work, and had a large number of people measuring trees and keeping track of, in days predating GPS on your cell phone, keeping track of where everybody was all the time. Some of the folks that worked for Mason Bruce Girard at that point would remember tallying the trees that were measured and recording them in order to compute the total volume of timber that was being transferred. I can't speak to the specifics of the calculations for Arcata Redwood, who, by the way, was later acquired by Simpson, but I can't speak to the specifics of Arcata Redwood or Louisiana Pacific. But there was a tremendous amount of manpower expended making the determination of volume and valuation, obviously. The work that I did with Mason Bruce and Girard was, to a great extent, as was taxation, focused on the financial side of the timber industry effort. And we found ourselves and I found myself during the period from the mid-'70s until about 2000, when transactions sort of slowed down in the timber industry, involved in a large number of large acreage timber transactions. All of that work required valuation and required guessing at what the market was going to be, and a lot of times we were wrong. But one of the books that I have on forecasting says that, in one of the quotes that I cited for often for individuals, was that forecasting is really difficult, especially when it's about the future. And so there's no question that people that value timberland and expect certain things to happen will not always be right. In general, timberland and the value of trees has increased at something in the range of rate of increase that we expected, but certainly within years and any given decade, things didn't happen exactly like we expected. During the period of time I've been involved in forestry and management of timber stands, I have been able to witness a pretty dramatic change in private land management. During the early part of my career, a high percentage of forest land in California, in large ownership forest land in California, was owned in corporate structures. And more recently, and today, we find that the ownership structure is closer to private. The largest landowner in California is certainly a private company now, and most of the California forest land that in the 70s, up until the 70s, was owned by large corporations, Georgia Pacific, Louisiana Pacific, I'm not attempting to name everybody, but those are two examples. Most of those lands are now owned either by family ownerships or by some form of investor group that has a longer, it can have a longer view of life and of timber, the life of a timber stand. And that has been a real positive, I think, for timberland in California. And there's no doubt that the harvesting, the impetus for harvesting timber is different today than it was in the 50s, 60s, 70s, when pretty clearly it was extractive, and today it's management. I like to think that I played some small role in that whole transition, and I've maybe fortunately been around long enough to see several stands of timber that were either clear-cut or cut heavily, return to a stand that has a tremendous amount of volume standing on every acre today. And so I've enjoyed being involved in that aspect of forestry. Historically, the management of government lands by both the Bureau of Land Management and Forest Service has been viewed differently than the management of forest lands by private landowners. However, today, to some extent, there is more commonality of management efforts between forest landowners, private forest landowners, and the federal and much smaller extent state landowners. In that, the goal is really similar now, which is long-term management for the benefit of not only the guy who works in the sawmill and or someone who wants to build a house, but for the benefit of the land itself and the trees that are growing on it. And so I think that we probably will continue to see, even though I made a comment earlier about forecasting, I think we'll probably continue to see a move on both the government ownerships and the private ownerships toward effective long-term management. The government ownerships are certainly more weighted by public input than a lot of the private land ownerships. However, with the extensive work, especially in California, but in other states as well, that is required to develop a timber harvesting plan today, there is ample time and area for public input into timber harvesting operations. During the late 70s, probably starting in about 79, the possibility of utilizing chipped wood material direct from the woods to furnish fuel for biomass to energy plants on a large-scale basis became a possibility because of pricing of electricity. And I really became interested in that area, and to the extent that probably for several years during the 80s and 90s, 30% of the firm's income was somehow associated with studies that were involving biomass to energy plants. And we became conversant with biomass to energy developments across the continent, including several places in Canada and states in the southeast and the northeast, so that we were involved with a lot of financial institutions that were putting up the cash required to build these plants, and our expertise was in determining whether or not there would be adequate fuel supplies available to run those plants. And so we really did develop a pretty good piece of business involving biomass to energy plants. That actually led to the work that I've been doing since I retired or resigned from Mason Bruce Girard. And I guess I prefer to use that term, because I don't think of myself as retired, but which is okay, as long as I'm still walking around. But in any case, we really did develop a very good knowledge base about plants all over the country, and I've done work in most of the northeastern states, the Lake States area, Kentucky, West Virginia, a lot of areas that really did benefit from being able to produce electricity. And someone, and it turned out that in some cases it was us, had to go figure out whether you could actually develop a fuel supply for those plants. And that involved dealing with machinery that would go to the woods and harvest the material, chip it up, and deliver it to the plants in general. Today, 2017, biomass energy is not being developed to the extent that it was in the 80s, and it's primarily because there is a situation in California where, and all over, not just California, all over the United States, where the benefit of removing the excess burnable material from the forest and the benefits of doing the thinning work that can be done if you can develop fuel for biomass energy to energy plants has really not been evaluated, in my view, properly, and we are facing, or have faced for a long time, a situation where biomass energy pricing has to compete directly with pricing from natural gas and other sources of power, clearly on an economic basis, considering the cost of biomass to energy operations as compared with opening up a valve and starting a turbine on natural gas. It just costs more to develop biomass into energy. I think one of the things that would be a huge benefit long term in management of forest land from the standpoint of developing healthier forest and less fire-prone forest would be to work out either a tax benefit method or some government subsidy method that would allow people to manage their lands in a more effective way for developing healthier stands. And converting it to energy is just clearly a byproduct of stand management. But we really do need to do that. As a forester, I was involved in several projects that were really fun for me, and part of that work would have involved growth analysis for trees. Somewhere buried in the files, I have some stuff that I did on huge spreadsheets by hand with a slide rule and a calculator in the 60s relative to growth analysis for a tract of timberland that I was involved in with Paul Bunyon. And it was just has always been extremely interesting to me to understand, to try to understand. I'm certainly not assuming I understand all of the attributes of growth analysis, but to try to understand the methodologies for obtaining growth information and analyzing it so that we could understand the growth of timber stands. I remember being involved in a logging operation in 1965 in part of the Garcia River drainage, where there were essentially no trees over 15 inches in diameter left on the land when we finished. It was a redwood stand, and in 1992 or 3, I was back on that same hillside harvesting 20,000 board feet to the acre and leaving some trees. I have told my grandkids about that, and specifically that it is clear that if we manage trees and stands of timber properly, they will be there for their grandkids, and I'm still excited about that. One of the things that foresters doing the sort of work that I did would absolutely be involved in would be both exchanges and partitions. Those two things, where there might not be a direct sale, require understanding, and maybe beyond that, being able to explain to participants in terms that they will either understand or accept, dependent on the individuals, that the values that are being discussed are, let's say, acceptable to all parties. That becomes a huge factor in determining whether or not parties will agree to a land exchange. We were involved in land exchanges between private companies and government companies and private companies, never, to my recollection, between two government agencies, but certainly between private individuals and companies. And in order to effect a change that all parties can accept and walk away from feeling like they benefited, it is necessary to be able to not only do a good job of evaluating what you're looking at, but also being able to explain what you did. One of the exchanges that I felt particularly good about occurred sometime in the 90s, and I was working out an exchange between some private individuals, smaller owners, and a large company. The private owner had agreed at one point in the conversation that they would accept a particular piece of land as being 1/3 of the value for this tract of timberland. And the company who was to get another third of it agreed that that was acceptable with them. I came into the office one morning and had a call from the representative of the private individual who said that she really did not want to go forward with that. She wanted the other parcel. And I had the uncomfortable requirement to call the representative of the company, the larger company landowner, and tell him that the other participant didn't want to go forward. And the response that I had from the company was one of the best things that I could ever have heard. He said, okay. And the reason he said okay, he explained later, was because he thought that the valuation that we had developed for both parcels was appropriate, and he was willing to accept either. His counterpart, the woman that we were dealing with, had more of a personal involvement with the land, and she just felt more comfortable with the other. It turned out with the other parcel. So being able to reflect on the fact that we must have developed something that another very knowledgeable individual would accept from a valuation standpoint was a good thing. So partitions and exchanges were fun, and I enjoyed them. One of the not infrequent assignments that a consulting forester would agree to take up would be representing a taxpayer in front of either the State Board of Equalization or in front of the county assessor. I did have several experiences doing that sort of thing. Most of the direct representation of individuals in or with local assessors was in California in the case of timberland, but I did also represent the federal government in a couple of instances where they were dealing with other entities. One of the projects that I was involved in was an appraisal of the Zuni Indian Reservation as of about 1860 something or other, just before the railroads came across the United States. That representation was actually a situation where Mason Bruce Girard was representing the Department of Justice on the opposite side of the table from the Zuni tribal group. We spent a lot of days and time in musty cellars of courthouses in the Southwest, looking at old transactions to figure out what a property might have been worth in 1860. We did find some what appraisers would call comparable sales, and we were able to apply the values that we found there. And I'm not certain in that case that anybody was happy because I don't think that the tribal group could ever have been happy because frankly they felt that they wanted the land, and I don't. There are a lot of reasons that I don't blame them for that, but the government folks, I believe, felt like we came up with a credible valuation, and the matter was settled. If not successfully by all parties, it was settled. And on several occasions, I represented timberland owners in California who believed that their, especially prior to the yield tax being implemented, believed that their timberlands were being overvalued by the assessors. that was something that you could hear from any forester representing any timberland company. Yeah, the assessor is just wrong. Well, whether the assessor was wrong or not may be dependent on what the company would have agreed to sell the timber for if they'd had an opportunity to sell it. So it was a we had several situations where the assessor was believed to have overvalued timberland, and fortunately I was usually in the position of being able to obtain some adjustment, if not a complete adjustment. There was usually some adjustment. So it was always interesting because the assessors had a really tough job. They're honestly were usually understaffed from the standpoint of being able to collect all the information that was necessary, and they were just not because of the fact that they were representing a taxing agency. They were usually not on friendly terms with all of the timber landowner representatives, and so it was to say the least interesting sometimes dealing between those two parties. During the time that I was working with Mason Bruce Girard in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, we had several international projects where we were representing people that owned timberland, specifically in my case, timberland ownerships in Australia and the Philippines. And I was fortunate from my perspective, being able to go and work with some local foresters in both of those countries, specifically the Philippines, doing inventories of large tracts of timberland. One of the opportunities that I had in the Philippines was to remeasure some plantations that my by then partner, Gwyn Scherer, had supervised putting in the ground in the south end of Mindanao, which is one of the islands in the Philippines, a place that you probably don't want to go today. But in any case, I went there and remeasured or measured some plantations that he'd been involved with a few years before, and I remember just being absolutely astounded by the height and diameter growth of eucalyptus that he had planted in areas that had been harvested years earlier. And we were able to develop a yield table that showed showed the expected rate of growth for some eucalyptus plantations. At the same time, we did do some inventories in virgin stands of what I take to be virgin stands of jungle species, and I remember measuring trees with buttresses that were 20 feet in diameter, and it was a very interesting experience. I really enjoyed it. In Australia, Gwyn Scherer, my partner, had been involved with one of his clients who was planting some large tracts of Monterey pine, and I was able to go there and look at and work on some of those, and I really enjoyed it. And I went back to Australia again, actually, primarily to Tasmania, to work on some biomass projects in the early 2000s. So I've had some opportunity to be there, and then I had a son that was in the Philippines for a number of years, and got to be there with him. And again, as foresters do when they go to a new place, figure out what trees they're looking at. When Brad Seberg and I, who were two of the partners in Mason Bruce Girard, decided to resign in 2003 and form Continental Resource Solutions, which I'm operating today, we did that with the intent of becoming involved as owners in some power generation projects. From a business standpoint, I will say that I probably didn't make the very best decisions as far as acquiring a fortune, but it certainly has been a lot of fun. We have been involved with, at various times, 4 or 5 different biomass to energy plants, and we are still involved with a biomass to energy plant on the coast in California, and out of that grew an understanding, and I credit Brad Seberg with a tremendous amount of this insight, that we could probably work with the Forest Service to harvest and do thinning operations if we had a economic means of paying for that harvest. And so we started working on how to do it. We first experimented with a sawmill, which may or may not have worked, kind of depended on whether we had cooperative investors, which we did for a while, and we did develop a sawmill that would handle small diameter, primarily because this was located in northeastern California, small diameter pine trees, and we were successful in cutting some of those. For various other reasons, that project is not in operation at this point, which I'm a little sad about, frankly. But then Brad and I began to focus on, instead of making lumber, could we make dowels, posts and rails and that sort of thing from both thinnings and the tops of trees that were too small to make lumber. We began to work on that probably in maybe 2005 or 6, something like that. And fortunately, today we have an operation here in Redding that is doing exactly that. And we're combining making dowels, fence posts, and rails, making some firewood for sale out of the pieces that won't be manufactured into round material, and we're able to sell the chipped biomass that comes off the outside of these round trees, or round tree pieces. And what we are purchasing to make that material is today primarily the tops of trees that would otherwise be left in landing piles in the woods. And we actually, if we can take everything that we would like to take out of those landing piles, they would be probably 30% as dense and high as they are normally. We can, with the material that we're utilizing, we can utilize things down to 3 inches in diameter, and the whole piece doesn't have to be straight. So we get truckloads of material delivered, And today we're producing about a truckload of finished dowel product every day, which has been it's been a fun project, and I've gotten to work with my kids and grandkids doing it. I'm always amazed at how much we are able to do with technology today, and I happen to have some children and grandkids that are involved with it, and I got to watch our bucking station operate essentially automatically the other day as programmed by one of my grandkids. So it's been fun, and operated by another one, by the way. But it's been a fun project, and we've enjoyed it, and primarily I enjoy it from a forester's standpoint because we're able to pay enough for the material delivered, the raw material delivered, so that people can afford to get it out of the woods, and maybe even leave a little bit left over for the landowners. We're working with several foresters right now to have deliveries, and we expect a lot of wood to be coming into the mill this year. What we are utilizing from the tops of harvested trees, not talking about thinnings of plantations at this point, or thinnings of natural stands, but from the tops of harvested trees, we're actually able to pay enough for that material to be delivered. The harvester and the logger has to have, in order to make it work economically, he has to have a timber processor on his landing, and instead of leaving the top of the tree with limbs on it, if he runs out to the point where the stem is 3 inches, cuts that off, he can send that to us, and we can pay him enough to pay for doing the processing, and as I said, maybe even in some cases, if it's close enough, a little left over for the landowner. I have had occasion to be involved in several court proceedings, Superior Court and U.S. Court in a couple of cases. I've been involved in tax court cases, and have been involved in other valuation cases. One of the things that I guess I would pass on is that you want to be very careful when you plan to go to court about how you prepare yourself. And I will tell you that my dad, who was a farmer, and after the war continued to be a farmer and an occasional seller of firewood and various milk products. In talking to me one day when he knew that I was getting ready to go and appear in court, said to me, the only thing that you really can talk about are the facts as you know them. And so I would offer that as probably the best advice that I ever received from anybody about how to prepare yourself to go to court. Just plan on talking about what you know to be the fact. And that's honestly what I tried to do. I certainly didn't always feel comfortable, and I think attorneys genuinely take courses in how to make foresters feel uncomfortable, but it was an interesting part of my experience. Fortunately, I didn't make a practice out of doing that. However, I I will say that in most cases I was on the side that prevailed, and I guess I'm kind of proud of that. I know there's some question about when I joined the society. You and I we were talking about this the other day, but the my recollection is that I probably joined as a student in maybe '64 or something like that. But I certainly have been a member for quite a while, and I think that the Society of American Foresters is a really important part of the profession of forestry, and I have been a continuing member, and I honestly tried, although I wasn't as involved as a lot of people were. I did go through the chairs in the local chapter, and I was involved in a few statewide areas and issues. But I think that the association, the professional association, being able to converse with other professionals is something that has tremendous value. I recommend that employers try to make it possible for their employees to be involved in society affairs. I know that there's always discussion about who pays and that sort of thing, and I think from the standpoint of professionals who are also employers, that it's something that they really do need to pay attention to and try to make sure that they make an opportunity and to make it clear to other professional employees that while it's not an expected thing that you have to be involved, that there will be support if you are involved. And I feel like that's what I've tried to do in my involvement. People that know me well, and maybe you can see behind me there are bookcases, know me well, know that I have enjoyed books and enjoyed information. I have, while I was in college working for the Pacific Southwest Forest and Range Experiment Station, I was introduced to the Oxford system of classification for magazines and pamphlets and articles, and I employed that myself during my career, and for whatever good or bad reason, I have 6 or 10 bookcases that are filled with pamphlets out in the hall right now, and those are cataloged according to that system. But the important thing that I want to say about the society's role there is that while I was in college, and of course after, I was able to utilize the research systems that were available for helping to classify and to understand various phenomenons that were going on in the forest. The Journal of Forestry has, I don't know exactly how long it's been published, but probably close to 100 years, if not more. The Journal of Forestry is a magazine that I continue to read today. However, I want to say that the new publication by the Society, which is the Forestry Source, I think is the title, is something that I have just truly enjoyed. And one of the reasons that I enjoy it is that while reading a research article in the journal is, well, I'll just say it requires concentration. reading the forestry source is more like picking up a newsy magazine and figuring out from that some fun things that are going on or important things maybe that are going on in the forest industry. So I really compliment the journal and the SAF staff on the forestry source as a means of getting information out. It's interesting when I think about young people. I have a grandson that's working in the forest industry right now. Actually, three grandchildren that are working in the forest industry, but one that is, I think, sincerely considering a forestry business career. I think that one of the things that foresters today need to do is to realize that although we have pictures around of logging trucks with 3 log loads on them and big trees that were being felled and run through sawmills, that the product of the forest today is so much more varied than the product of the forest in 1950s, 60s, 70s, that we really need to be receptive, well, if not receptive, at least understanding that there will be varied interests that are represented by the people that are involved in forest management these days. There are products that we all know about today that we couldn't have known about in the first 3 decades of my experience, certainly. Today we're involved in evaluating the carbon production in forests, and in the 1950s and 60s we just knew that trees furnished lumber, and they were convenient. It was convenient to be able to cut them down and convert them into lumber. Today, quite appropriately, I've been involved in the last 10 years in evaluating carbon production as one of the commodities that is being produced in forest. We talked a little bit earlier about one of the projects that we're working on now to utilize parts of trees in the forest that will otherwise be wasted, or, if not wasted, create a hazard from the standpoint of fire-prone forest. So for a young forester that wants to be involved in forest management today, I think that he needs to be, or she needs to be, thinking about what products are really available, and maybe those products aren't just the hard, solid, square wood products that we used to think about. Those products are going to be a lot of different things. One of the projects that or one of the types of projects that I was involved with as a forester working with Mason Bruce Girard is the area of resolving conflicts between entities that had gotten into a business deal, and things that turned out differently than either of them had expected, and maybe one side was reaping the windfall benefits of something that had happened in the industry, and the other side was suffering because they were looking at tremendous change in values. One example would be a situation that developed between two of our clients in the 1980s, when when the value for true fir species began to really come into its own, and there were some contracts between these two particular entities that had been negotiated 20 years earlier, when the value for the true fir species was minuscule, and in fact I could take you today to areas on Forest Service property where the Forest Service in the 1940s was insisting that true fir species be cut. The timber had no value, no economic value at the time, and so the loggers cut them, hauled them to an adjacent piece of private property, dumped them in a canyon, and they were there rotting when I was there inventorying the property in the late 70s. So things change, and the idea that I was just presenting is the sort of economic change that can result in people having serious disagreements with each other. We were able to be instrumental in that case. I will say that the side that I was representing probably didn't get recognition of values like they would like to have had, but there was some movement on both sides. And in the case of resolution where there's just flat out disagreement about values and what's appropriate as a valuation issue, I was privileged to be involved between some pretty good-sized corporations in a couple of instances where we were able to pull together enough facts so that both sides had to agree that if you accepted the facts, that there should be agreement at about a certain level. And I felt like we did a good service to our clients in that instance. But the way that you have to, or the thing that has to happen in order to have resolution, is that both sides have to be willing to accept what the facts are. And in the one early case that I discussed, the facts were that the contract that was entered into was very clear, and the party that we were representing didn't get all of the recognition of value change that they would like to have. In another case, the value that was assigned to a particular part of an exchange that was being entered into by two large corporations was different for one party than the other, and the facts at that point were on the side of the second party. And once we were able to show that the facts were clearly representing what was going on in the context of the present day at that time, they were accepted by both parties. I particularly recall, now that I've started to talk about that, I particularly recall being in the conference room representing my position, and on each side of the table were the representatives of very large corporations who had vast experience, a whale of a lot more experience than I had. But at the end of the day, they both of those representatives, who were both experienced businessmen and both realized that they had to come to resolution, they were able to agree that the facts did show what they showed, and I walked out of there without being stepped on by either elephant, and so I was happy. I've worked in a large number of forest settings, forest types. I've worked in the tropics. I've worked in the coastal areas of the Northwest in California. I have worked in inland regions, and my view of forest is that I really love them all. I will say, and this almost borders on being I'll back out of that. One of the most pleasant experiences that I enjoy as a forester is being in a young growth forest in the springtime, when even with my old ears I can still hear the buds popping. It just makes me feel good to do that. I don't have any ideal forest that I would separate and say that's the only one that I really think is ideal. I have been blessed to be able to work in as many areas as I have, and I truly have enjoyed all of the forest types that I have been in. There's little that can compare with a warm spring day when a young growth forest is all around you and you can see how vibrant it is. You can hear whatever critters are out there making their way around. But there's also little that can compare with being in an old growth stand in northern Arizona, where there are slow growing pine trees around you, and you can just look up and experience the feeling of being in an area that is there because someone decided that it would be important to maintain it. I have very much enjoyed doing this today, and I certainly have tried to make it clear to all of the people that I've worked with and my kids and grandkids that none of us controls everything, and none of us is ever fully responsible for everything, but we all play a role, and I have truly enjoyed being a forester, and I've felt like I was able to be an important piece in some of the things that happened that I was involved in.